Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Do you want to get a lot of practice free motion quilting some feather designs? Well, this video I'm going to show you how to quilt a really cool feather design I'm using in the sashing rectangles of my Flower Festival quilt. So let's get started learning how to quilt these feathers together. So I have marked my feather design on the fabric, and the reason I did this is I want this feather to turn out exactly the same way every time I quilt it, and the only way to ensure that is by marking it. And so the place to start is on your stem, and I just pulled up thread there, and then now I'm quilting along one side of the stem, and I want to quilt this nice and smooth. I want to try not to wobble, and I want to also try to stay right on the line, but if I do get off the line, it's not really a big deal because this line is marked with water-soluble thread. It's going to wash out. So it's not a big deal if I end up quilting off the line or I make a mistake. So the first thing I'm going to do as I quilt this design is I'm going to quilt the stem entirely. So I'm quilting down from one side, and then I'm going to quilt back up, kind of echoing it. So that way it's like a foundation. It's really the baseline of a feather design, and I like to have that knocked out completely before I start forming any feather shapes. So now down here at the bottom end of the design, this is symmetrical. The design is the exact same, just reversed on the bottom. And so I'm basically coming into this curve, and I want to be real careful to, again, make it nice and smooth, not wobbly, and stay right on that line. And notice how much I'm rotating things around. That is absolutely allowed. It's a-okay to rotate your piece around so you can see what you're doing and so that you can stay right on that line. The reason why we quilt something and make it something small like this is so we have better control over it, and so we can rotate it around and be able to quilt it just right. So now I came to that point, and I'm basically just echoing back along this spine line, and it's very, very simple quilting, but notice how slowly I'm moving. I'm maintaining a nice steady speed with my machine. I'm keeping my hands a consistent distance apart, and then whenever I can't see, I'm rotating the whole piece around so I can see and so it feels nice and comfortable. So often I see a quilter, trying to quilt something maybe in a class, and it looks very awkward, and I ask, and usually the quilter will tell me that it feels very awkward, and that's something you want to watch out for. Anytime that it feels awkward, what you're doing, that's a sign that you need to rotate things around and find a more comfortable position. And if you can't see, maybe you're quilting with the block behind you, you wouldn't be able to see that line back here and be able to quilt along it just right. So rotate around, that's absolutely allowed. So now I'm coming back around to the beginning. This is where I started, and I went on ahead and tied off and buried that thread tail just so it was out of my way. And I think that's something that's really important. When you get started quilting, just stitch maybe about 3 to 4 inches away, and then go on ahead and tie off and bury that thread tail so it's just out of your way. It's off the quilt. You don't even have to think about it. There we go. So that is the center stem stitched, and now you can decide which way you want to go. You can quilt the feathers to the inside or the feathers to the outside. It really honestly doesn't matter. So just pick the side that looks good to you. I think I'm going to go to the inside first, and we're going to flow out with the feather, just following that line, and then return to that starting point. Now there's a lot of different ways to quilt feathers, and I want to cover a few different methods here. This is called a travel back feather, meaning I'm traveling back along that line, and then I'm curling out and around to form the next feather. So here I'm touching against the stem, and then immediately traveling back along it to form the next feather. And I like this one. This is my favorite type of feather to quilt because the travel stitching is always in the same consistent place. And what that means is it's always between the feathers, and I think it adds a nice little emphasis to the feathers and makes them stand out nicely. But this isn't the only way to form a feather shape. There's lots of different ways to form feathers actually. You can do the travel stitching along the stem. So here I'm going to travel stitch down the stem to the next feather. This is called a bump feather. I'm going to travel stitch down, I'm going to quilt back up, around that feather shape. I'm going to bump against the feather before, and then now I'm going to bounce back, and then I'm going to bounce forward and quilt the next feather. So that series of steps it takes like a little bit more concentration, because you have to think, okay, right, I'm here on the stem, I need to travel down to the next feather, come up, bounce against the last one, bounce to the forward. You know, it's a little bit more to think about. That's why I really prefer travel back feathers, because it's always the same repetitive motion. You're always traveling back and swinging out. It's always the same thing, and that's kind of dependable. Now, the other thing that can be a little awkward for quilters is the direction that you quilt your feathers in. You can see we're curling out and then down. And this is actually not a very, that's not a very natural feel to me. How I prefer feathers, I'm going to travel stitch down here so I can show you how I prefer to form feather shapes. I really prefer to curl up and around instead. And I know that sounds maybe a little silly, like what's the big difference here, Leah? But it's the difference in how the feathers are curling. It's how they are curving. So here's the direction I prefer, is to kind of have the feather growing up from the stem, and then I stitch around that curve and then down the back of the feather. I just like that motion. And then I'm going to touch against the stem and travel back. So it's still the same travel back feather. The difference is that instead of working in a downward motion, I'm working in an upward motion. So then now to form the next feather shape, all I'm going to do is just bounce outward. Just travel stitch along that last feather and then bounce out with the next feather. So I hope you can see it totally doesn't matter which type or style of feather that you choose or how you quilt this. There's no right or wrong way, and especially when you have the lines marked, it's really a free-for-all. You can kind of go about this in any way that you want. You can try a lot of different methods of quilting feathers here. It's one of those interesting things that I found when I first started quilting. Anytime that I watched a feather tutorial, it was kind of only one method was shown, and usually that method I found didn't really work for me. And so for a long time I just thought, oh, I just can't quilt that. You know, I'm not good at it. And it took me several years and a lot of playing and marking designs like this on fabric and just kind of trying to force it before I found the method and the direction that really felt natural to me and felt very easy to stitch. So if the methods that I've shown you in this video don't work for you, please don't feel bad about that. I think this is one of those shapes that's just very unique to each individual, and I don't think there's a single way to stitch it. And I really encourage you to just mark it up, play with it, and see what you think. So now travel stitch down, and we've got this overlapping area, and basically we're going to start from the stem and curl out with this set of feathers. And this is really cool. I love this little part of the design. When I was creating this design, I thought, oh, it would be kind of neat if we basically took two feathers and stacked them on top of one another and almost created a little bit of a grid area where they were overlapping. And that's what we've got. We've got this rather asymmetrical grid here in the middle, and I think that really looks nice. So I'm just going to continue the same path. I'm travel stitching back along that feather, curling out for the next feather, and then back down to the stem. If you cannot see, please rotate. I had a little bit of trouble there just seeing that, the rest of that line. I knew it was pretty much a straight line at that point, but I think next time I form that shape, I'm going to rotate it around so I can really see what I'm doing. So I'm going to get to this point and rotate it around and quilt again. It's easy to think that we're supposed to just stitch something without stopping, but as you can see, I stop a lot. I stop and reposition my hands. I stop and think about the design and consider which direction I want to go in and how I want to tackle it, and that's a-okay. It's fine to stop any time in a design. Just make sure that as you're stopping, your needle is landing in the down position. What that does is just make sure that if you push on the block or something, the needle is locking the quilt in place so it can't shift, and you can't end up with a big weird stitch right there where you stopped. So if you don't have an automatic needle down option on your machine, just rotate your hand wheel. Rotate that around and just make sure that you're always stopping with the needle down, and then that way you know you can stop anytime and you can stop safely. So now I'm curling out and around the top of the feather shape, and these feathers are getting a little smaller and a little wider, kind of a little plump little feather here. So as you quilt them, just focus on that nice round shape. It's almost a circle. In fact, when you think of feathers, you can think of teardrops, kind of angular teardrops. It's a really interesting way of thinking about them. So always think of that curve as just a nice semicircle shape, and that will set you right. So as I form each of these, I'm just trying to maintain my hands in a nice comfortable position, swing around, and come back to that stem and touch against it. If you accidentally overshoot your stem, don't worry about that either. Travel stitch back over it, throw some more thread at it, and that usually will hide any little stitch off, stitch issues like that. And it's not a big deal. Picking up your seam ripper and ripping something out takes a lot of time. And when you're ripping something out, you're not quilting, you're not learning how to improve. So instead of doing something like that and getting really nitpicky with your work, just throw some more thread at it, stitch over it a few more times, add some thread painting. There's so many ways that you can hide mistakes with quilting, and it's very forgiving. And if you stitch off the lines, like here, I stitched off the line a little bit in both directions, no big deal. That line's gonna erase. No one will know that I meant to stitch in that spot. So now I'm curling back around to this tip, and all I'm going to do is just keep quilting feathers the exact same way I've done before. So as I swing around with these shapes, I'm just traveling back along the feather I just stitched and focusing on connecting with that stem, just stitching right up to it, maybe one stitch onto it and then back. And then now we're back this is where we started, but on the opposite side. So we finished up here at the tip of the feather, and if you notice, this is basically symmetrical. So what you get on one side is reverse symmetrical with the opposite side. So from here, we can quilt down, forming those feathers, and then around to form that other end. For me, because I know forming feathers works best if I'm curling out and around, I might travel stitch down along that stem and reach this point and form those feathers going that way. There's no wrong way of doing it, and a little extra travel stitching, it's not a problem. In fact, actually, it adds a little extra drama to your feathers. It makes them stand out a little bit better on your fabric, and it puts a little bit of space between each one so they look really pretty. So as you create your sashing rectangles, you're going to need to create 31 of these. I encourage you to try many different ways of forming feathers. Try the travel back feather, try the bump feather, try different directions, whether it's forming them out and around or forming them basically from the top down. Try lots of different things, and I promise by the time you finish all 31, you're definitely going to know how to quilt this design. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning how to quilt this feather design with me today. Definitely subscribe to my videos on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new quilting videos we have coming out every week. Now, if you're looking for the pattern, you can find that at leahday.com/blockparty. This particular feather design is found in the Sashings and Cornerstones pattern. So check it out, and until next time, let's go quilt.